a veteran, battling through pain, slowly made his way toward Buckingham Palace. Every step was a struggle, but his medals glinted proudly, each one telling a story of bravery. The royal guard stood motionless, watching intently. Then, as the veteran's legs gave out beneath him, something unexpected happened. Protocol was set aside, and what followed brought the entire crowd to a hush of silent respect. Here's what happened. But first, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more powerful moments like this. Now, let's begin. Dawn broke over London with the kind of golden light that photographers dream of, casting long shadows across the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace. The city's heartbeat was still slow and rhythmic, just beginning to stir from its slumber as the first commuters hurried past the iconic gates. Among them, tourists already gathered with cameras ready, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Queen's Guard in their scarlet uniforms and towering bearskin hats. Standing motionless at his designated post was Corporal John Miller, a figure carved from discipline and duty. His boots gleamed like black mirrors, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his rifle held at the precise angle drilled into him through countless hours of training. To the casual observer, he was simply another piece of the grand pageantry that surrounded the palace, a living statue, a symbol of British tradition frozen in time. Yet beneath that ceremonial exterior, Miller's mind was constantly alert, his senses attuned to every movement, every sound, every subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. This heightened awareness wasn't just the result of his guard training. It was a skill forged in the crucible of combat, honed during his deployment to Afghanistan, where the ability to read danger in a split second meant survival. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant traffic, but sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, Miller could swear he smelled the dust and cordite of Helmand Province. Those were the moments when his grip on his rifle would imperceptibly tighten, when his jaw would set a fraction harder, when the ghosts of his past would whisper reminders of battles fought and friends lost. As the sun climbed higher, painting the palace walls in shades of amber and gold, a solitary figure emerged from the early morning crowd. Captain Daniel Hayes moved with the deliberate gait of someone who had learned to negotiate with pain as a daily companion. Each step required conscious effort, each movement a small victory against a body that had been shattered and painstakingly rebuilt. The ribbons and medals adorning Hayes' chest told a story of valor and sacrifice that few would ever fully understand. The Distinguished Service Order caught the morning light first, followed by the gleam of his military cross and the subdued colors of his Afghanistan campaign medal. These weren't mere decorations to Hayes, they were sacred trusts, representing the courage of men who would never wear them, never feel their weight, never return home to polish them with loving care. Every Sunday morning for the past 8 months, Hayes had undertaken this pilgrimage from his modest flat in Pimlico to the palace gates. The journey had begun as a prescription from his physiotherapist, a way to build strength and endurance in legs that had been rebuilt with titanium and determination. But somewhere along the way, it had transformed into something more profound, a ritual of remembrance, a way to honor the fallen, a defiant declaration that he would not be conquered by his circumstances. His wife Margaret had initially resisted the idea, her worry evident in every line of her face as she watched him prepare for these weekly expeditions. She understood his need for purpose, his struggle to find meaning in a world that suddenly seemed too quiet, too safe, too removed from the brotherhood he had known in uniform. But she also knew the cost of his stubbornness, had seen him collapse from exhaustion, had held him through nightmares that left him trembling and disoriented. The injuries that had ended Hayes' military career had occurred on what had started as a routine patrol through a village in Helmand Province. The intelligence reports had suggested the area was secure, the local population friendly, the threat level minimal. But Afghanistan had taught them all that security was an illusion, that death could arrive without warning in the form of hidden explosives and calculated ambushes. The first blast had been devastating, erupting from beneath the lead vehicle in a shower of metal and flame. Hayes had watched in horror as his lieutenant, a young man barely out of Sandhurst, was thrown from the wreckage like a broken doll. Without hesitation, Hayes had sprinted into the kill zone, his own safety forgotten in the face of his responsibility to his men. He had almost reached the wounded officer when the second IED detonated, turning the world into a maelstrom of pain and chaos. The field hospital had been a blur of urgent voices and desperate procedures. Hayes drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting to survive while his mind struggled to process the magnitude of his injuries. Shattered bones, torn muscle, severed nerves. The medical team worked frantically to save what they could, to preserve what remained of a warrior's body. Through it all, Hayes' first concern had been for his men. His constant questions about their condition, requiring sedation to quiet recovery, had been a war of attrition, fought in sterile hospital rooms and rehabilitation centers, months of learning to walk again, years of adapting to limitations that would have broken a lesser man. The physical pain had been manageable. It was the silence that nearly destroyed him. After 3 decades of command, of constant action, of being needed and necessary, Hayes found himself adrift in a civilian world that seemed to move without purpose or urgency. Now, as he approached the midpoint of his Sunday journey, Hayes could feel the familiar burn in his reconstructed legs, the signal that his body was approaching its limits. The titanium rods that held his bones together conducted the cold morning air, creating an ache that went deeper than muscle and sinew. But he pressed forward, driven by promises made to ghosts, by a sense of duty that transcended physical discomfort. Miller, maintaining his rigid posture at the palace gates, had been tracking Hayes' progress with growing concern. Years of combat experience had taught him to read body language, to recognize the signs of someone pushing beyond their capabilities. There was something different about the veteran's approach today, a subtle change in his rhythm that suggested he was fighting harder than usual against his limitations. The gathering crowd of tourists seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding before them. They were focused on their cameras and smartphones, capturing images of the famous guards for social media posts and vacation albums. They saw the spectacle but missed the humanity, the stories of service and sacrifice that stood behind the ceremonial facade. Hayes' breathing had become labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort. The pain in his legs was no longer the dull ache he had learned to manage, but a sharp, insistent reminder of his body's rebellion. Still, he continued forward, his eyes fixed on the memorial that marked the end of his journey, his mind filled with images of the men who had inspired this weekly pilgrimage. Private Thompson, barely old enough to vote, who had died clutching a photograph of his girlfriend. Sergeant Rodriguez, a career soldier with 3 children, who had been planning to retire after this final deployment. Corporal Jenkins, whose infectious laugh had kept morale high, even in the darkest moments, whose final joke had been about the quality of the hospital food. These were the faces that drove Hayes forward, the memories that made every painful step worthwhile. Miller's training demanded absolute stillness, unwavering attention to duty regardless of external circumstances. But his experience in Afghanistan had taught him a different lesson: that true service sometimes required breaking the rules, that honor demanded action when action was needed most. As he watched Hayes struggle, something deep in his soldier's heart recognized a kindred spirit, a fellow warrior who refused to surrender to circumstances. The first sign of serious trouble came when Hayes' left leg began to tremble. It started as a barely perceptible shake, but Miller's trained eye caught the subtle movement immediately. Hayes was fighting it, struggling to maintain his composure, but the tremor was spreading, visible sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Hayes knew what was happening. He had experienced these episodes before, during his darkest days in rehabilitation, when his rebuilt body would simply refuse to obey his commands. The doctors had explained the medical reasons: nerve damage, muscle fatigue, the inevitable consequences of trauma. But understanding the cause didn't make it any easier to accept, especially when it happened in public, surrounded by strangers who might interpret his struggle as weakness. The tourists were beginning to notice the unfolding drama. Cameras began to turn from the guards to the struggling veteran, more from curiosity than genuine concern. An elderly couple whispered to each other, their expressions shifting from mild interest to growing alarm. A young backpacker paused his conversation with friends, his attention caught by the veteran's obvious distress. Miller felt his internal conflict intensify with each passing moment. Every aspect of his training, every regulation he had memorized, every principle of military discipline screamed at him to maintain his position. But his combat experience whispered a different truth: that sometimes the greatest act of courage was knowing when to abandon protocol, when to choose immediate action over proper procedure. Hayes managed another 20 yards before his right leg gave out completely. For a heartbeat, he caught himself on his walking stick, the polished wood taking his full weight as he fought desperately to regain his balance. The gathered crowd gasped collectively, a sound that seemed to echo off the ancient palace walls. Several onlookers stepped forward instinctively, but uncertainty held them back, uncertain of how to help, whether their assistance would be welcome. Afraid of intruding on a private moment of struggle. Time seemed to slow as Hayes' walking stick slipped on the smooth stone pavement. His body, already pushed beyond its limits, could no longer compensate for the loss of balance. He pitched forward, his arms reaching out instinctively to break his fall, his metals catching the morning light one final time as gravity claimed its inevitable victory. But Hayes never hit the ground. In a movement that seemed to defy both physics and protocol, Miller broke formation. Years of ceremonial training were abandoned in an instant as he lunged forward, his reflexes honed by combat taking over. He caught Hayes just before impact, his strong arms providing the support that the veteran's body could no longer manage. The crowd erupted in surprised exclamations. Camera flashes sparked like lightning. Someone shouted in alarm, but Miller heard none of it. His entire focus was concentrated on the man in his arms, this stranger who somehow felt familiar, this veteran whose struggle he recognized as a reflection of his own journey. "Easy there, sir," Miller said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced far greater crises. "I've got you secure." Hayes looked up into the face of his unexpected savior, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away. He saw not just a young guardsman in ceremonial dress, but a fellow soldier, someone who understood the weight of duty and the cost of service. The pride that had driven him to attempt this journey alone, the same stubborn independence that had made him resist help, suddenly seemed less important than the simple human connection he recognized in the younger man's eyes. "Thank you, Corporal," Hayes managed to say, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion, but carrying the unmistakable tone of one soldier addressing another. Miller carefully helped Hayes to a nearby bench, his movements respectful and deliberate. The tourists maintained a respectful distance, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended the usual tourist attractions. A few continued to record the scene, but most simply watched in reverent silence, understanding that this moment deserved their attention rather than their technology. As they settled onto the bench together, Miller felt the full weight of what he had just done. He had abandoned his post, violated the most fundamental rules of his assignment, broken the protocol that had been drilled into him through months of training. But looking at Hayes, seeing the gratitude and recognition in the older man's weathered face, he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. "Afghanistan?" Miller asked quietly, the single word carrying layers of meaning that only another veteran could fully comprehend. Hayes nodded slowly, his hand moving unconsciously to his damaged leg. "Helmand Province, 2009. Lost my lieutenant to an IED. Tried to get him out. The second blast caught me before I could reach safety." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "You can probably guess what happened next." Miller's expression remained controlled, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of shared understanding. "I was there too. 2012. Queen's Company, 2nd Battalion. We heard about your patrol, what you did for your men that day." The words hit Hayes like a physical blow. This young man, this guardian of ceremony and tradition, had walked the same dust-covered roads, had faced the same hidden enemies, had survived the same crucible of combat. They were connected not just by uniform and service, but by shared experience, by the invisible threads that bound all who had served in that distant, dangerous theater. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that existed between men who had been tested in the furnace of war and emerged changed but unbroken. Miller found himself thinking about his own journey home, the sleepless nights when London's traffic would transform into the rumble of armored vehicles, the moments when a car backfiring would send him diving for cover that existed only in memory. Hayes, meanwhile, was studying Miller's face with the practiced eye of a veteran officer. He could see beneath the ceremonial composure to the man underneath, recognizing the telltale signs of someone who had learned to manage his own demons. The slight tension around the eyes, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the careful control that spoke of hard-won battles against invisible enemies. "Do the nightmares ever stop?" Hayes asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the question carrying the weight of countless sleepless nights. Miller considered the question with the careful deliberation of someone who had spent many hours wrestling with the same concerns. "They evolve," he said finally, his words chosen with precision. "They don't dominate you the same way after a while, but they become part of who you are, part of the price we pay for coming home when others didn't." It was a brutally honest answer, more honest than Hayes had expected from someone so young. The doctors, the therapists, the well-meaning friends and family members, they all wanted to believe in complete recovery, in magical moments when everything would return to normal. But Hayes knew better, and apparently, so did Miller. Your commanding officer is going to have some serious questions about this, Hayes observed, nodding toward the guard post that Miller had abandoned in his moment of decision. Miller's response was a slight shrug, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and defiance. Some things are worth the consequences. Some choices are bigger than career advancement. The simple statement carried profound implications. In those few words, Miller had articulated something that Hayes had been struggling to understand for months. That true honor wasn't about blind obedience to regulations, but about knowing when to break them for something greater. That duty wasn't just about maintaining position, but about taking action when action was needed most. The crowd around them had begun to disperse, but not before numerous smartphones had captured the scene. Within hours, the video would begin its viral journey across social media platforms, gaining momentum as it spread. The image of the Queen's Guard breaking formation to help a struggling veteran would resonate with millions around the world, becoming a symbol of compassion and courage that transcended national boundaries. But for now, in this moment of quiet connection, the two men sat in relative peace, sharing an understanding that went deeper than words. Miller found himself thinking about his own father, a Falklands veteran who had carried his own invisible wounds, who had never spoken about his experiences, but whose nightmares had sometimes woken the entire household. Hayes was experiencing something he hadn't felt in months, a sense of being truly understood. Without the need for lengthy explanations, Margaret tried her best to comprehend what he was going through, and his adult children were supportive in their own ways, but they couldn't fully grasp the weight he carried. This young soldier, this unexpected guardian angel, understood without needing detailed accounts of combat or trauma. "Are you married?" Hayes asked, the question emerging from genuine curiosity rather than mere politeness. Miller nodded, a slight smile softening his features. "Sarah, we'll celebrate our second anniversary next month. She teaches primary school, loves working with children." "Does she worry about you? About what you've seen and done every single day?" Miller admitted, without hesitation. "She tries to hide it, but I catch her watching me sometimes, waiting for me to fall apart, I think. Afraid that one day I won't come back from whatever dark place my mind visits." Hayes smiled with sad understanding. "They all do that. My Margaret has been walking on eggshells for months, terrified that if she says the wrong thing, asks the wrong question, I'll finally break completely." "And will you?" The question hung in the air between them, direct and uncompromising. Hayes considered it seriously, as he had many times during his darkest moments of solitude. "Some days I think I might, but then I remember that they're all counting on me not to. The men who didn't make it home, my family, even strangers like you. We're all connected in ways we don't always understand." Miller's replacement had arrived and was waiting at a respectful distance, clearly uncertain about how to handle this unprecedented situation. Miller noticed him, but made no move to leave immediately. This moment was too important, too fragile to be interrupted by the demands of routine duty. "I make this journey every Sunday," Hayes explained, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Started as physical therapy, really. Had to have a destination, something to walk toward. But it became something much more significant. These walls, this history, it reminds me why we do what we do, why we sacrifice parts of ourselves for something larger." Miller nodded with complete understanding. "I think about that when I'm standing guard. All the men who stood here before me, all the ones who died protecting what this place represents. It makes the ceremony feel less like performance and more like sacred remembrance." "Exactly," Hayes said, his eyes brightening with recognition. "It's not about the tourists or the photographs. It's about continuity, about demonstrating that the values we fought for are still worth defending, still worth preserving." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Miller's commanding officer, a stern-faced major who had clearly been briefed on the situation. Both men straightened slightly, military bearing reasserting itself despite the civilian clothes and ceremonial uniform. "Corporal Miller," the major said, his voice carefully neutral but carrying undertones of authority. "I need to speak with you about what happened here." Miller rose to his feet, coming to attention with practiced precision. "Yes, sir. I'm ready to accept full responsibility for my actions." But before he could take a step toward his superior, Hayes struggled to his feet as well, his walking stick supporting him, but his posture unmistakably military despite his injuries. "Major," If I may interrupt, the corporal's actions were exemplary. He saw a fellow veteran in distress and responded with exactly the kind of courage and compassion that this institution should represent. Any disciplinary action would be. He paused, choosing his words carefully, inconsistent with the highest values of military service. The major studied both men for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he weighed protocol against humanity, regulations against recognition of extraordinary circumstances. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Corporal Miller, return to your duties. We'll discuss this matter in detail later." As Miller prepared to leave, Hayes reached out and gripped his shoulder with surprising strength. "Thank you," he said simply. But the two words carried the weight of profound gratitude, not just for preventing my fall, but for reminding me what true honor looks like in practice. Miller met his eyes steadily, soldier to soldier. "Thank you, sir, for showing me that standing guard isn't just about maintaining position. It's about knowing when to move." They shook hands, a gesture that somehow carried more significance than any medal or formal recognition. Two men, separated by age and rank but united by service and sacrifice, sharing a moment of mutual respect that would resonate in their memories for years to come. The story could have ended there, with Miller returning to his ceremonial duties and Hayes continuing his journey home. But the video footage had already begun its viral spread across the internet, and within days, the simple act of one soldier helping another had captured the imagination of millions around the world. The military, rather than punishing Miller for his breach of protocol, found itself facing a public relations opportunity that no amount of money could have purchased. The medal ceremony 3 weeks later was intimate, but profoundly significant. Hayes, standing straighter than he had in months, pinned the medal for meritorious service to Miller's chest. While photographers captured the historic moment, the medal itself was less important than what it represented: official recognition that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not in combat, but in the quiet moments when we choose to help each other. In his brief but moving speech, Hayes spoke eloquently about the nature of true service, about the bonds that connect all who wear the uniform, about the responsibility we all share to support each other when circumstances demand it. Miller, characteristically, said little during the ceremony, but his presence spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. Someone who understood that duty meant more than following orders, that honor required action as well as intention. The months that followed brought lasting changes to both men's lives. Hayes continued his Sunday walks, but now with renewed purpose and unexpected company. He had become something of a local celebrity, and people would stop to speak with him, to thank him for his service, to share their own stories of family members who had served. He found himself becoming an unofficial counselor, helping other veterans navigate the challenging transition from military to civilian life. Miller returned to his ceremonial duties with a deeper understanding of what it meant to stand guard. He maintained the same rigid posture, the same unwavering attention to duty, but now he carried with him the knowledge that true service sometimes required breaking the rules, stepping out of formation, choosing compassion over protocol when the moment demanded it. The bench where they had shared their moment of connection became an unofficial memorial, a place where people would leave flowers, small tokens of respect, handwritten notes of gratitude. Neither man had intended to create a monument, but their simple act of human connection had touched something deep in the public consciousness, serving as a reminder that heroism comes in many forms and often appears in the most unexpected moments. Years later, when both men reflected on that autumn morning, they would remember not the media attention or the public recognition, but the moment of understanding that had passed between them. In a world that often seemed fractured by differences of opinion, background, and belief, they had found common ground in service, in sacrifice, in the simple recognition that we are all connected by our shared humanity and our obligation to help each other when help is needed most.